From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I am Ken Davis, and I noticed today in the Chicago Tribune, at least on the Chicago Tribune website, that Jeremy Gorner has written a few things about some statistics that we ought to know. Through Sunday, ladies and gentlemen, homicides in Chicago were up 43% this year, 396 up from 276 a year earlier, statistics are now showing. Shooting incidents are up from 1,380 to 2,040, that's a 48% spike. And it goes on and on about how it's happening in a lot of cities. The great Lee Bay commented the other day on his Facebook page, you could fill the Oriental Theater, every seat in the Oriental Theater, and have 500 people wandering around in the lobby of just the people who've been shot in Chicago this year. Think about that. Anyway, Jeremy Gorner has been writing a bunch of really good stuff about Chicago police and the situation that we're in right now, and I'm honored to have you at the table today for the first time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And also making her way into television for the first time. She's been trying for many years to get on Chicago Newsroom, and Carol Marin has finally achieved her dream.
I have, and I am so excited about it.
Carol Marin probably needs no introduction, but she's of course with Channel 11 and Channel 5 and now DePaul University, which I think is incredibly cool, teaching the young'uns, huh?
I love it, yeah.
That is a great thing to do. All right, where to begin with this? Well, I think we might begin with Baltimore, just begin someplace completely different, because the feds yesterday came out with a stinging, scathing indictment of the Baltimore police. And of course, we all know they're also looking at Chicago right now. Anything can be predicted from this?
It's the template. It's the template that the Justice Department will apply, I think, to this city as well. And if you look at what they wrote about Baltimore and you compare it to what the task force analyzed about racism, police problems, governmental problems, the economy, the community, I think what you see in Baltimore, like a transparency, you're going to simply superimpose largely, and it's what justice is going to say about Chicago.
And you know, a lot of the crime in Baltimore is concentrated in minority communities, just like in Chicago. That's where a lot of the crime problems are, and presumably that's where you're going to see a lot of confrontations between police and the public, more so than in safer neighborhoods. So with that, you're probably going to see a lot more officer complaints. You're going to see a lot more allegations from citizens that of racial bias. And in Chicago, a lot of the time, I mean, we've heard really mostly just anecdotes about this. And I mean, who knows if it's statistically, if it really bears out, but I mean, what you saw in Baltimore, no doubt, they're going to look at the same thing in Chicago, considering the fact that a lot of the problems we have here with violence, with the distrust between the police and the community is rather similar. In Chicago, of course, is on a larger scale because it's a bigger city.
And there's something about it that's just really kind of eerie to see the similarities between Baltimore and Chicago. I mean, obviously a smaller city, but when you look at some of those statistics of, I'm just pulling them out of the top of my head, but something like 95, 98% of the stops are happening in 11% of the geography of the city. 95% black.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just from talking to police officers and to talking to critics of the police, like the ACLU, for example. The ACLU for years has done studies about racial profiling. The police department has come back with that and said, well, again, a lot of the crime happens in these neighborhoods. It's a little more complicated than that. And a lot of the crimes that are reported, when they get a description of an offender, it's a person of color, for example. So there's going to be that tension on either side, in each side. I mean, it's really kind of hard to assess what's true and what's not.
Yeah. Well, I guess the thing that sent me to both of you is the whole issue of the Paul O'Neill shooting, and what is a very interesting sort of new day for the Chicago Police Department. They released 9 videos, virtually a week after it happened, and I'm sure all three of us probably have the same reaction, to sit and binge watch, and we've seen the whole thing, and it's amazing to watch. There are all kinds of people all over the place on the internet and elsewhere who are commenting on this and saying that these videos prove that the Chicago Police Department mishandled this issue. Is that the way you see it? Was there police screw up, and if so, was it serious? What are we learning? And of course, I want to put that in context of what we would normally know about an event. We see more images now. It's really interesting.
On the one hand, what you see are officers having to make split-second decisions, which is something that I think if all of us in our workplaces had to wear body cameras, you would find that it wasn't a pretty sight a lot of the time, because how we deal under pressure, the sort of reckonings we have to make with fear are substantial. But what you see, and what I believe Superintendent Eddie Johnson saw and acted upon quickly, were certain basic tenets that were violated. Among them, you don't draw your gun in the car. Why? Because you may be slamming on the brake and you may end up shooting in that car. You don't fire at a moving vehicle that's moving away from you when you don't know who's in there, and when the vehicle is the only thing right now at issue. Your life is not at stake. And when you're firing, you're not firing at the same time that a police car is coming in, so that the trajectory of that bullet could go not just to the offender, but to your fellow officers. And so I think on a variety of levels, basic rules taught, or that should be taught in the academy, basic police principles, were violated, and that is something that the superintendent did see. Now, was there mitigation? Were there other things that the officers had to take account of? Sure. And is the video the last definitive and only witness to what the meaning of the shooting was? No, probably not. But it is a window, 9 pieces of a window.
9 videos, yeah.
And remember, in Laquan McDonald, the cameras weren't working.
Right.
In this case, many, though not all, of the cameras were working, and there was audio, which we didn't have
the
in
audio
Laquan McDonald.
makes all the difference. Of course, the shooting itself was not captured, right?
Right, and there's, the police department has come up with several explanations for that so far. No one really knows what happens. No one said anything officially, but for example, the officer who fired the fatal shot was in the second vehicle in that video that sustained the most severe damage.
Right.
He and his partner from the Jaguar, they had the most severe
And by
blow.
the way, if I might interrupt, you just have to see this video of that head-on collision. I mean, it knocks you out of your seat.
No, it
really.
does.
You're just kind of
It
sitting
really-
there
it's
watching.
startling,
They're tearing into this scene, and they see this car coming at them, and the next thing you know, bam! They're head on.
Right.
And then they get out of the car, and they're immediately in action, and we don't know this for absolute sure, I guess, right? But this is happening at the same time that the other guys down the other end of the block are shooting at this car.
Right. So when you hear them say they were shooting, one of the officers say they were shooting at us, right? I
Right.
mean, that
They were, except it was the
evidently,
cops.
evidently it was the officers. I mean, there was a lot of confusion that clearly, we've reported on, that Carol's reported on.
Yeah.
And also that the other thing too, the police have come up with several explanations as to how the officer who fired the fatal shot, why his body camera wasn't operating at the time. I mean, it could have been that in the car accident, maybe the camera had shut off accidentally. Maybe it had fallen off. He picked it up. Who knows?
Yeah.
Another possible explanation is that maybe he thought the camera was on the whole time, and then when he turned it on, he thought it was off, or vice versa. Because you got to keep in mind, these officers just got these cameras.
In his case, just a couple of days, right?
Right, and it's what Eddie Johnson has said. It's what Dean Angelo, the FOP president, has said. It's a learning curve, and they got the cameras 8 to 10 days prior, but that doesn't count days off that these officers may have had. And it's it's like, how often were they going from call to call where they actually got the chance to use the cameras?
And yet, there is a dawning that you witness in watching this as officers, as they begin to sort of collect themselves and figure out what has just happened, that suddenly officers are referring to each other as, remember what you're wearing, you know, and
Right.
and so there is a sudden mindfulness of what you're saying and what you're doing is being recorded.
Right. I don't, like I said, I don't want to exaggerate this, but I have a feeling that those videos will be frozen in time. I think every police academy in the world is going to be watching those, and they're going to be saying, this is the world you live in now, and it's not going to get any better or any easier. So you have to understand that unlike anybody else in the world, when you're in the thick of it, everybody's going to be able to watch every millisecond of it and analyze what you did.
I think you're right, because I think there's two issues here. Was the shooting justified, or was the shooting because of lack of training? And I think that if people look at that video, just from talking to experts, talking to other police officers, there clearly were some serious training issues based on looking at that video. The problem is that the actual fatal shot that killed Paul O'Neill, we don't know what happened because that wasn't captured on camera.
And we don't know exactly when he was shot, because as he runs from the vehicle, we don't know if that gunshot was sustained in the vehicle,
While he was in the vehicle.
even because many of those bullets, unless you're shooting right into the engine block, which would stop a bullet, they can go right through a driver door and a passenger door. So we don't know when he was shot. I think the police department has a pretty clear idea of which officer did do the fatal shooting, but all of that is going to have to be laid out, and ballistics will tell the tale with some definitiveness.
We see the, I guess, second responders coming up to this gate, which is locked, and one officer scrambles over, and the other two can't make it, and they run around or whatever it is. We presume that guy who got over the gate was the officer who shot. But we don't even know that.
We don't know that, but what we do know is he's going, and this is another question of protocol, he's going over the gate, helped by, I think, one of the other officers to boost him over, but he's got his gun drawn. We know the danger of that, again, is anything can go wrong, and so you have a weapon that is potentially engageable as you're being tossed over a fence.
It's interesting to me that at least 3 officers, of course, as we know, have been, whatever it is, put on administrative leave, whatever the protocol
Desk
is.
duty.
Desk duty. And yeah, well, we heard him complaining about that on the video.
Well, one of the officers says, and this may be, certainly was one of the shooters, and maybe it was the ultimate shooter, but I'm going to be riding a desk for 30 days.
When I heard that, I thought, my initial instinct was that when he says, I'm going to be riding a desk for 30 days, there's a new policy where they have to ride a desk for 30 days if they've been involved in a shooting. Doesn't mean they're relieved of their police powers. That's just protocol. But what Eddie Johnson did here is he didn't just take that step with these officers that they're going to be riding a desk for 30 days as a matter of protocol. He actually did relieve them of their powers.
Their police powers.
So that's what I was a little unclear about in the video is, did he mean, am I going to get relieved of my powers, or am I just, because I'm involved in a shooting, I'm going to get that?
There are so many, there's so much to talk about here. These officers are so unaware of what these cameras are recording, and they're just having these very unguarded conversations about, well, I think I shot, didn't I? But then there's this moment when you think, now they're already starting to play to the cameras, where somebody says, he did shoot at us, didn't he? I'm trying to clear myself here. I want to get my, my story straight.
I think we have to remember what a really hard job this is.
Yes.
That you are in a dangerous situation. You're trying to stop an offender. Your decisions are hairs of individual seconds, and that's your first command. You've got to go do the work of the police. And then you've got to step back and go, what's going to happen as a result of this? I mean, they're human. We would be doing the same thing.
And even Superintendent Johnson was saying that, he's been involved in 4 shootings in his career or something like that, and several cases of where they're going after stolen vehicles. And you're going to say things at the initial crime scene that you may regret later. It's an adrenaline rush, and it, you know,
But fortunately
like Carol
for
said,
him, those things weren't recorded.
right.
If you're in an emergency room, medical humor, if the patient was conscious to hear it, would be horrified.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you're in a newsroom,
right.
and
Oh,
you know,
oh.
and you know this, and you know this, and I know this, there are things, there are sort of icebreaker, tension breaker,
Yeah.
crazy and inappropriate things that get said
Right.
that just kind of, you know, blow out the window.
Well, I've said repeatedly on this show and other places that even when I was a younger man, I couldn't have done that job for an hour. So, you know, it's not exactly
Right.
it's not exactly easy to criticize it. But there is something, and again, I don't know if this is just this lack of familiarity that we're seeing something new or what, but there is this kind of overriding sense I get of a kind of chaotic scene. I mean, everybody's asking everybody, what happened here? And nobody's getting a straight answer. And the white shirt starts showing up and saying, okay, were there two people in the car? And some people say yes. It's crazy. Maybe that's normal, and maybe that's something that we're learning. But it does seem, I have to say, there's a certain air of kind of unprofessionalism about it. The very free use of profanity, the idea that the guy is on the ground and they're like pounding his head into the pavement and swearing at him, and he's already, as far as we can tell, probably half dead. He's going to die about an hour from now. These are the things, these are the raw things that we all have to begin to live with. We're watching people die on camera.
Well, and with Laquan McDonald, if you remember, and this was a question that came up in our newsroom when the video was finally released. After Laquan McDonald is shot 16 times and he's laying on the pavement, there is no one going up to that body except one officer who kicks the knife away to keep it out of the distance. But there's someone, I mean, he isn't covered with a blanket. He isn't, someone isn't taking his pulse. He's left there in the street. And one of the things that I think we all have to understand are the optics of that. Yes, he was shot. They judged that he was a threat of some sort. But now he's got 16 shots in him, and there is no attempt until finally the paramedics come to put him on a stretcher and put him in the wagon. I think we have to think in human terms about this as well, and the same for Paul O'Neill.
This is one of these things that this has just been, I assume, standard operating practice, but now we're seeing it, and it's having a different impact. Right. And I actually wanted to ask you if either of you even know about that. I mean, the idea that he was so quickly handcuffed when he appears to have been, you know, pretty mortally wounded, is that training? Is that police protocol?
It's generally
you
police.
just don't know. He might
rise up.
That's
He-
police. Yeah, they
Right.
do that. That's protocol.
Yeah.
And the foot that the officer has on the back of his leg, I mean, part of that is that, I mean, you are still in a restraint mode because you don't know.
Right.
But there was an officer who said, and he's on camera, I think call the EMTs or call the
Right.
paramedics.
Yeah, he called the paramedics pretty
immediately.
immediately.
I
Yeah.
actually clocked it, and I thought that it happened. I wrote it down here. It was a minute and 30 seconds after you're hearing the shooting in the alley that there's somebody saying on the same
An
video.
ambulance was dispatched within 3 minutes.
Right, and got there according
of
to
the
my
shooting.
checking. The fire engine got there in about 6 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like a pretty normal.
Yeah.
There were like no delays or
Right,
anything like
right.
that. I think kind of what you're talking about, Ken, is that we're for the first time we're seeing how all this stuff
Right.
kind of works, and I think it's kind of an education for reporters too.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we go to crime scenes, we have the lens from behind the yellow tape,
Right.
and yeah, we can eavesdrop on what police are saying to grieving families, what they're saying to witnesses, the
Mm-hmm. Right,
best
right,
that we could,
right.
but you know, this kind of takes you within a crime scene.
Well, there's even that interesting moment where one of the sergeants says to one, I presume he's one of the 3 officers, who just kind of won't shut up about, you know, I was the shooter. He's just like, look, cool out. somebody put him in a car, the media's going to be here soon or something.
Right.
You know, it's like, we don't want him running around when the cameras are out here. And again, I'm not saying that in a critical way. This is the business we're all in, right?
Well,
we all have to.
Well, at a lot of police shooting scenes, even if it's not a fatal police shooting, they'll move the crime scene. I mean, they'll take liberties in moving the crime scene back, you know, away from us. Well, especially if it's an officer who shot.
Yeah.
I've noticed.
Yeah.
And if an officer fires shots, you know, to come to another officer's aid, I mean, they'll usher that officer away from the scene very, very quickly because they know that there's going to be a crowd forming, whether it's the media or whether it's people from the
Can we
neighborhood.
address the issue that I know is getting a lot of play right now, and that is this idea that why such a huge response for a guy who's driving a stolen vehicle? I mean, is it? We're not police officers. We're not qualified to judge this, but just from a sort of a legal and protocol perspective, that seemed like an awfully large amount of response.
I think there's a lot we don't know. It appeared from the video there were only 2 squad cars that responded to the stolen video. It's stolen car. Yeah. It seemed as if more police showed up to the scene once shots were fired.
Yeah. Okay.
And
All right.
you know, evidently, if they thought they were being fired at, then yeah, that's going to generate more of a response.
And if
from
you're in the
police.
neighborhood, and you know, and there's a general declaration of if shots being fired, if you're not otherwise engaged, you can converge on the scene.
I thought it was just really interesting. I mean, there were so many things like the I guess the car that actually was the car that ended up in the accident, so might have been one of the cops who actually shot him. That car came from so far away. I mean, there's like 5 minutes of hair-raising, you know, dash cam video of this car racing to the scene.
Well, and the other thing too is that the officers who were involved in that shooting were not from the district where the shooting occurred.
Oh,
they were
that
from
right?
a bordering district.
Oh.
So
that would explain why they were kind of like a little
little
confused
bit
about where they were. And
I mean, I guess it's possible, but that might explain why, based on your perception, that they were a little far away because the shooting, because that's right near, I think 75th Street is the border between South Chicago and Grand Crossing, the two police districts.
Right,
I believe it's it's that area over there. So.
And the other thing I just have to say is a big shout out to the woman, whoever she was, who was on dispatch. Boy, I tell you, it was just like through this entire thing, you're hearing this, we have 2 officers, can someone clarify for me, is it 1 officer or 2 officers? And just like this paragon of professionalism and just kind of trying to keep a lid on things. It's an amazing experience, and as I say, I think as journalists, but also just as citizens, we have entered into a new era until they learn how to control those cameras in a way that, because they will, the consultants are already being hired to give training. Hopefully there's going to be a lot more training, but there's also going to be training on how and when to speak in front of the cameras. I was interested in Second City Cop, which of course, you know, we all turn to every day to see what that voice is. They very quickly turned this into a training issue. I was
They
fascinated
did,
by
and
that.
over 3 days, and in a pretty granular fashion, they said, you know, you may not like this, fellow officers.
Right, exactly.
You may not like this, but, and they raised, among many issues, the business of drawing your gun in a vehicle, firing at a moving car. They really dissected this with police eyes, and with an eye to, a friend of mine is a brand new Chicago police officer, and I sent to a family member of his the Second City Cop citation saying, for no other reason than just observe this as a training exercise, take a look at what other police officers have decided to say. Now, a lot of people don't like Second City Cop. It can be a pretty toxic website, but it also can say some pretty trenchant things about what's going on.
Well, I was kind of impressed with it. I mean, I just a quick quote, pull quote from it here. while the most serious violations are departmental in nature and not criminal, that isn't going to save certain members from administrative action. What we've seen here we consider a monumental failure in training and preparing officers for street duty. So that's a kind of an interesting view.
What we also saw from that video is that there wasn't much diversity in an African American neighborhood. I saw only, and I didn't see all of them, but I think only one African American white shirt, right, sergeant? I think an Hispanic officer, and I believe
There were a couple, but yeah.
But virtually everyone else on the scene was white. And one of the complaints that you hear from the community, and one of the issues raised by the task force that the mayor appointed, was that the community doesn't see its face reflected in the people who patrol its neighborhoods.
So do we give credit and kudos to Eddie Johnson and by extension the mayor for this new openness, or
I think
what?
I think in a way, I mean, they had to do it, right? I mean, Laquan McDonald was a total game changer, and had that video not been released, who knows, what changes would have been made or would have not have been made. So I think it's really kind of tough. I mean, you've heard the mayor, and even the previous police administrations talk about transparency, but I mean, we've never seen anything like this before, And I mean, is it kudos? I mean,
or is it about time? And frankly, for those of us who are still fighting with Freedom of Information Act requests for the law department, the police department, IPRA, even under a new day, we are still not getting the documents or the materials that the public is entitled to with the speed outlined under the law. So transparency is still not achieved in this city in a fulsome way.
And you have my personal guarantee that if you go to any of the sites that have these 9 videos and watch them, you'll be pretty amazed. It's really something to see, and I hope that you'll do that. The other thing, Jeremy, that you've written about that I think is so important here is this whole notion of predictive policing. I'm fascinated by this, that like everything else now, our lives are driven by bots and algorithms. And tell us what you have found about what Chicago police are doing with just showing up at people's doors and telling them, we think you're in trouble.
Well, late 2000s, they started experimenting with a scientific approach to predictive policing. It was called predictive analytics, where they've always kind of looked at hotspots, right, where crimes occur the most. They send their resources there. I mean, that was widely credited for the massive homicide reduction under Phil Klein in the early 2000s. But as the decade progressed, they started becoming more techie, and devoting more resources to just like, the algorithms, and they were working with IIT. And
Ron Huberman sort of made his name, didn't he, at the police department with bringing in.
He was the data guy.
Data
I mean,
stuff.
and he brought it over to CPS, where along the same lines, they identified kids who were likely to get into trouble or be killed or harmed.
Yeah.
And so it was an extension of that same thought process.
Right. And I guess for Chicago police, they shifted their focus from where crimes occur. I mean, they still focus, their attention on those hot spots, but now they're trying to figure out a scientific way to figure out who's most at risk. And, they have so many variables. It's not race or gender. It's basically what kind of crimes have you committed? Have you committed a gun crime, a drug crime? Who have you been arrested with? Have you been shot before? Have the people you've been arrested with been shot before? Because the logic there is who you hang out with. If you hang out with the wrong crowd, you could be next, and they have a ranking system for these people. And I know I've talking to a lot of police officers on the ground. I mean, some of them, I think it's kind of 50-50. Some have said, well, this is extraordinarily accurate because so-and-so had a high strategic subject list score. It was like in the 500s.
It's kind of like your credit rating. You have a number,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. And now he's dead.
He's dead.
Yeah.
Others really don't bother with it too much. I mean, it's such a new thing. It's really hard to to determine how effective it is. I mean, I think one can say it's got a way to go because, I mean, violence is up, right? But it's just a new way where they're looking, it's kind of like a ranking system. They're figuring out who's most at risk. And the second part of it is they'll show up at their doorstep. It'll be a commander or other officers and somebody who's like maybe a clergyman or somebody from a social service agency to kind of say, hey, look, we're here to try to help you turn your life around because, what you're doing now, you could end up in jail or you can end up dead. And, what is it that you want to do with your life? And, and some of these people will say, well, I need drug and alcohol counseling, or I want to get my GED. The story that you're referring to, the man we focused on, was a gang member in Logan Square. Police described him as a shooter for his gang. He was embroiled in a conflict. Police showed up at his doorstep, and when he sees the police show up, first thing he does, he runs into the house. He thinks he did something wrong. But they actually were there to try to help him, and he told them that he wanted to get a GED. And then since that visit last fall, he had been involved in 2 shootings, one which unfortunately took his life. So, I mean, it's just kind of a new thing that they're trying out, the police department. I mean, it sounds like it's the wave of the future, but
it also has this kind of weird, eerie part to it of just kind of like they did on July 4th, where they just go around and like kind of round up the usual suspects and kind of got the impression they just kind of sort of threw them in county jail for the weekend or something, didn't charge them.
But something else is happening too, I think. And while you can do these deep data dives and come up with a lot of really accurate numbers, what you're also seeing now in this city, I think, is the fraying of the fabric. We're seeing more crimes in neighborhoods previously not given to home invasions or carjackings. We're seeing these things happening in Lincoln Park and Lakeview more and more. You're seeing a lot on the Mag Mile. And I think, and at the same time, I think we're seeing more people who are begging on the streets of Chicago.
Absolutely.
And if you start talking about the forces, it's not just who's got a gun or who doesn't have a GED. It's who doesn't have a job, who has been lost in the system, whose father is in prison. I mean, the multipliers for this, I think there's a real pressure cooker in this city and other cities right now.
Right, and I do think, though, too, kind of to add what Carol was saying, I mean, just growing up here, I mean, I remember early 90s, when crime, statistically, violence was at its worst that Chicago's ever seen. I don't remember as much news coverage about that.
Didn't affect your life as much.
It didn't, and I remember, the Bulls winning championships dominated the news coverage more so than the violence did. Not that we didn't cover violence, of course we did, but now it's like you got Twitter, you have Facebook, you have 24-hour news now, and I know that that's something that over the years, I know former Superintendent McCarthy has talked about is that 24-hour news cycle, and I think it's really, I think because of that, it's really amplified a lot of what's going on too.
So we had this very interesting phenomenon where the ACLU and the police department had this kind of uneasy agreement, and the next thing we know, the contact cards go from thousands and thousands to tens and 20s. And it did coincide with this sudden rise that we're seeing in crime. There's a real opportunity there to link those two, but I'm not sure I believe there's a link. I don't know.
There's a couple things you got to consider with the contact cards. Under the previous administration, there was a big demand under McCarthy to stop people. I mean, of course, he wanted to stop the right people, but of course, what's the citizen's perspective, right? I mean, are they the right people? Who knows? And a lot of officers I've talked to felt under a lot of pressure to make numbers so that their commanders, when they go in those CompStat meetings, those weekly performance evaluation meetings, that they don't that they don't get chastised in
I
front of
always
their
think of
colleagues.
The Wire when I see that.
Right, exactly.
Those
They-
great scenes.
But now think about Baltimore, because one of the pieces of that Justice Department scathing report was that there were citizens, African American men, who were stopped 300 times
Right,
in the last X number of years, but not charged.
But never charged. Yeah,
And
yeah.
and then, as Jeremy is saying, you want to stop the right people, not just somebody who fits a demographic.
Right, and I think added to that too, as we kind of learn more about these contact cards, as time progressed, it kind of goes to show you just how complicated things are for the police out there. Balancing fighting violence, combating violence, and not violating people's rights. A lot of these officers I've talked to, they want to work. There's an overtime program that was established for officers in the last few years. After Hydea Pendleton died, they boosted it, where they put maybe a couple hundred officers each day working in like the 20 most violent neighborhoods. And in order to be eligible for this overtime program, you have to fulfill, it's not a quota, so to speak. That's what, but in a way, it's like, I don't know. I mean, they describe it as a quota. It's like
a
you have to
soft
get
quota.
in order to be eligible for the overtime. You have to make X amount of arrests each month, and
Is that right?
And you got to stop X amount of people. That's how it used to. I don't know if it still is.
Wow.
And you have to write X amount of contact cards. This is when the contact cards were around. So you figure. I mean, a lot of police officers I talked to speculated that there's an incentive to writing contact cards because you want to get that extra money to work overtime.
Yeah.
So who knows if that factored into the numbers? But now it's like with that ACLU agreement. I'll go ahead.
No.
Oh yeah, with now the ACLU threatened to sue
Yeah.
because of all these excessive street stops. So now the officers have to fill out 1.5-page reports to they're called investigatory stop reports,
Which caused a real rebellion.
which caused a real rebellion because number one, they take a long time to fill out. It takes officers off the street when they should be responding to calls, and plus there was a lot of confusion at first how to fill them out. I think there was a lot of repetition, but they really have to, instead of just writing a sentence about why they stopped somebody, like in the contact cards, they have to write like practically like it's like answering an essay question, how they do it, which I know that Eddie Johnson and the ACLU have both said that, well, yeah, there's going to be far fewer stops, but at least they're doing it the right way now. But is that contributing to this increase in violence? I mean, that's up for debate.
And none of it's black and white, is it?
No,
Because
I mean,
there's
a lot of criminologists would say no. I
Yeah,
mean, but
yeah.
but others have said that there's a correlation. I mean, it's
yeah.
debatable.
So I thought maybe we could end with just a little bit of discussion about the role that maybe the legislature has here. I've frankly gotten pretty sick and tired over the last 10 years of hearing everybody from Mayor Daley all the way on down saying the problem is we don't have strong enough gun laws to put these kids in jail. But now I'm starting to wonder. I don't know. We're starting to see a lot of police agree that this is a problem. That just the possession of an illegal weapon. Maybe we need to step that up. I don't know. Do you guys have any sense of that?
Yes, and maybe I don't have the right sense of it. But just as you said in the beginning and you said in the middle, I think we can say at the end, it isn't just about the guns. It's about, do you have a stake in your neighborhood? Is there anything going on in your neighborhood? Right. Is there a store or a school or a church or a work opportunity? And so some of these weapons things, I mean, they're petty family disputes. They're, again, like the pulling apart of a fabric. So sure, enforce the gun laws. But as Tony Preckwinkle will tell you, or Tom Dart will tell you, county jail is filled with people, many of whom have addiction and mental illness issues, way above and beyond gun issues.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting the piece that you and Annie Sweeney did about the neighborhood, Merrill, Merrill all of a sudden,
Yeah.
the street. The neighborhood that was impacted by this is a quiet, leafy, almost suburban African-American middle-class neighborhood where people own property, right? Where people have equity, they have
But South
investment.
Shore,
In
correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
So South Shore, the people who live in South Shore call it Terror Town. I mean, even the aldermen call it Terror Town because what happened when public housing was broken down and put away, there are a lot of single occupancy
Sure.
apartments as well as homes, and people, good law-abiding block club attending people are getting shot up in their neighborhoods.
Right.
So it's leafy and it's a kind of legendary old established neighborhood, but it's being terrorized.
And I think too, when Annie and I were doing that piece, one of the things that the residents wanted to get across to us is that, yeah, South Shore has this reputation in the media of being gang infested, which the community as a whole, I mean, statistically, unfortunately, there is a lot of violence, but not all of South Shore is like that.
Right.
Case in point,
Yeah.
the 7300, 74, and those are just only a few blocks. I mean, there are beautiful parts of South Shore where just kind of monitoring some of the day-to-day stuff, you don't really hear a whole lot happening, but like you go by 79th and Colfax, like Terrortown. I mean, you have the Gangster Disciples and the Black Pea Stones. They've been fighting for years over there.
I'm sorry.
And there are bus monitors, people who volunteer their time in the morning, who are helping kids get off public transportation and negotiate the invisible lines between what's safe and leafy and what is terror-filled,
Right.
so that they can get safely to school.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen administrators with walkie-talkies, bus monitors. I mean, these are people trying to keep the terror out of these neighborhoods.
My reason for bringing that up was because I was kind of tilting off of what you had said before, that when you live in a community where there is no equity, where there are not people on your block who are homeowners, who have work to go to and are woven into the community in every important fabric way, when you don't have that, then everything comes apart. So that's where we're at. Carol, I wanted to ask you one more thing, and I know I'm keeping you over time here, but you did such great work on Laquan McDonald with the Burger King video.
Thank you.
The missing of the 86 minutes or whatever it was. We can go back and recap that, but you can also do it yourself. Just go look it up. It's about how the police went to the Burger King and looked at their video, and then suddenly 86 minutes of that video were missing. And I've been wondering ever since that whether or not there isn't a legislative remedy that's needed here, because it raises for me these really interesting questions about whose video is it? Okay, if a private firm has a surveillance video running and it's running well and there's multiple cameras and something happens, I don't believe that it should be the police department's ability or right to just go in and edit that video.
But what happened
if
there?
that's what they did.
What happened there was that they called Burger King. They got a hold of the district manager, who was not on the site of that store, and he said, "We cooperate with police." So of course he instructed his employee there, give them the code that opens up the video. What the police on the scene didn't realize, though, was there were cameras outside the Burger King. Frankly, they were pointed in the wrong directions to capture much, but there was also a camera on them in the video room.
Yeah, right.
And these were officers who hadn't necessarily been on the scene but came in, and these were high-tech guys. These were people the police department relied upon to know. So in some cases, the irony is Burger King was the really good citizen in this and said, our video is your video. And then when the FBI arrived a couple days after that, the video wasn't there.
Yeah.
And I think too, at the time everyone was talking about this Burger King video, one thing I think that roused suspicion is that if you look at the DVD, that the city provided us. You see several little video files that are in 5-minute increments that for like, I don't know, maybe an hour before the incident, and then you see one like 8 o'clock, 8:05, 8:15, or 8:10, 8:15, etc. But then when it gets to about 20 minutes before the shooting, and then half hour after the shooting, then you start seeing the 5-minute increment, 10:45, 10:50. I mean, that really was kind of, and I think that's what the lawyers for McDonald's family were hitting on.
Well,
at the time.
and though Anita Alvarez and others said that it was judged by the FBI that the video hadn't been tampered with, I don't think, in fact, that is an accurate representation of what was determined. I think they couldn't determine what had happened to the video based
to
on
get
the
people to
sources
know what
we've
they're
talked
doing
to.
do the editing.
And they haven't fully established what's happened, what exactly happened.
No,
Yeah.
because that's because the U.S. Attorney's Office is investigating Laquan McDonald. The Justice Department is investigating the pattern and practice of the police
So we
department.
haven't heard the last of
We
this
have
Burger
not
King episode.
begun to hear the last
But
of it.
I raised it simply because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I mean, it's like, what if the body cameras and the dashboard cameras were like so many, you can just go to Home Depot and buy a Nest video that goes right to the cloud, and you don't even control it, right? You can run it for 24 hours. I mean, maybe that's where we're going with this, is that this video has to be sent to some unassailable place where it can be accessed properly later on.
I think the thing you got to realize too with these body cameras is that they're going to be very expensive to maintain.
They sure are.
I mean, I remember a couple of years ago we did a story about them in general and how Chicago was kind of shopping around.
Yeah.
And because there was a lot of success. In other cities, like 80% reduction in complaints from a small town in California, for example. But I remember talking to the LAPD about that at the time, and I think they cost close, or not the LAPD, one of the manufacturers said that they cost close to $1,000 each,
I can believe
but
it,
then
yeah.
that doesn't include the infrastructure,
You
like
think about a GoPro,
storing
how much
them.
that costs.
Yeah.
Storing them and storing the video
It's
files,
right,
and then when do you
right.
purge the video files, or do you have a repository
Right,
for the video? Because that's been the problem with the previously
Yep,
existing.
yep.
Like what's
cameras.
what's the retention?
Right.
Yes.
You'd need rooms full of servers just to store all of that data for years.
And that's why they're only starting with 7 districts right now.
Right.
So
Well, anyway, it's just been a fascinating week. It really has. I have to say, as a news junkie. I am so glad that we were able to get you both to the table today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jeremy, really good work that you guys have been doing at the Tribune on this.
Thank you.
You should be congratulated for it. Jeremy Gorner from the Chicago Tribune, and Carol Marine. Carol Marine, right here at this table. How about that?
Thank you very much, Ken. It's an honor.
Well, thank you. We will be back next week. I don't know, Barack Obama, I think, might drop by or something next week. But we'll have another program for you. I assure you we will, and hope you'll come back. But in the meantime, at this address, you can watch any of the Chicago newsrooms from the last, whatever it's been, 5-6 years, and spend the weekend watching old shows. I do it all the time. See you next week. Thanks. Bye.